Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, June 12th, 2024. I just got back from Snowshoe Mountain Bike Park doing some amazing downhill mountain biking. And I should say the trails were amazing, not necessarily my riding of them. But it caused me to think a lot about the difference between fear and anxiety. And so that's what I want to talk about with you today. All right, so when you do some very serious mountain biking, what you start realizing is that you can quickly get over your head or over your bars, as the case may be. And at Snowshoe, some of the features are just silly big, super dangerous, extremely high risk. There's a very famous gap drop called Cupcake Gap that I admit I was just too afraid to take. It's 11 feet high and 30 feet long, so you've got to clear 30 feet in order to safely land. I didn't do that. And the guys I was with, none of us did it. Now, we all thought about it and we wrestled with whether it was something we wanted to try to hit or not, but we decided not to because the risk was just too high. And it was interesting, as we were riding the ski lifts together, talking about these different features and what we wanted to do next, something that kept coming up was the difference between what we would have done in our 20s and what we will now do in our 40s. And as I said to one of my friends, look, in my 20s, I wasn't paying my own insurance and I wasn't leaving my son fatherless if something went really, really wrong. And in thinking about this, navigating risk relative to things that were just too scary, where my fear was higher than my confidence in my abilities, I started thinking about an existentialist distinction between anxiety and fear. Now, the difference between anxiety and fear is actually something that requires us to distance anxiety from the normal mode in which we think about it in sort of our contemporary culture. I have lots of students, for example, who have special accommodations in my classroom because they, have to navigate and deal with anxiety and depression on a regular basis. So for the sake of ease of reference, let's call that psychological anxiety. I am not qualified to talk about psychological anxiety. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist. I'm going to talk about existential anxiety. Now, what is existential anxiety as opposed to what we would normally describe as simply fear? And this is something where when I'm looking at a serious mountain bike feature, the fear is what's causing me to rethink the risk profile, but the anxiety that lies behind it is actually a positive thing. So let's talk about what that means. Well, for thinkers like Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Sartre and others who navigate these distinctions between fear and anxiety, fear is best understood as having an external or discrete object. I am afraid of something. I'm afraid of spiders, afraid of snakes, afraid of a gap drop that is probably too big for me to hit safely. Now, when we are afraid of objects, then the fear becomes an appropriate emotion in that specific instance or that circumstance, and for a very limited period of time to help me make smart decisions in order to be able to navigate life according to that fear. I am deathly afraid of very, very big bridges and overpasses, for example. I've talked about that in other videos and over at Substack. Sometimes I've got to cross the bridge to get where I'm going. And so despite the fear of that object, I make myself do it. I navigate that thing in order to bring about a state of affairs that I want to live into. Well, when it comes to existential anxiety, it's very different. Existential anxiety does not admit of an object. Anxiety has no object. It has no external thing of which or about which we are anxious. Instead, existential anxiety is more a condition of being the kind of selves or the kinds of beings we are. Whereas fear is a temporary, momentary thing that either causes us to say, I think I'm gonna miss this one, guys. Y'all go ahead and hit it. Or, shoot, I'm super scared of this, but I've got to get across the bridge, and so I'm going to simply control the fear so far as possible in order to bring about an intended result. Anxiety says, no, there is no thing of which I am anxious. Anxiety is simply something that defines the kind of being I am. Now, why would it do that? Well, for people like Kierkegaard and Heidegger, it does this because we are finite. We are necessarily going to die at some point, right? On a long enough time chart, a time horizon, the survivability rate drops to 0 for humans. So given that fact, we are, says Heidegger, being toward death as actually a constitutive ontological qualification. In other words, what it is to be human is to be toward fundamental limitation. We call that death. We call that vulnerability. So anxiety is not anxiety about a thing. It is an awareness of that fundamental limitation. So no matter what we do, what we believe, how we act, how we go about living our lives, they are all going to be necessarily facing a fundamental limit. Now, why is that limitation something that would ignite what is called anxiety? It's because we find ourselves not at ease with the stability or the constancy that we wish we had in the behaviors, actions, and lives we live. Think about how much we do in our life to try to convince ourselves that we are really stable and that things are really secure. We manage risk to try to minimize the risks that we take. But when it comes to our existential condition, risk is always necessary, essential, and in fact, the condition of meaning. So it's not that we try to avoid risk when it comes to living. It's how far will we go to embrace the reality that risk is unavoidable. This is what Heidegger calls authentic living. It's what Kierkegaard will describe as trying to live faithfully. When we live faithfully, what we're doing is actually taking up that risk, acknowledging the anxiety, because no matter what we do, there is no way to guarantee its permanence. The instability remains. Whatever we do, we could have done otherwise. That is something that is anxiety-inducing. So for the existentialists, anxiety has no object in the sense that we're not, anxious about death. We are anxious because we are dying things. Fear, you might be afraid of death as an object, but that misses what it looks like to live as somebody circumscribed by essential existential limitation. Now, why then would anxiety actually be a good thing in this existential sense? It's because it reminds us that although risk is unavoidable, which risk we decide to take up is actually a result of our agency. We can do otherwise, which means I could try to hit Cupcake Gap. It's also the case that I can decide, I'm going to miss that because I kind of want to go get lunch, not go to the ER. So being able to then take up ourselves relative to fear is conditioned by the essential qualification of being beings defined by anxiety in the first place. Our anxiety motivates the necessity of choice. It's what anchors the importance of making good decisions. So whenever we talk about anxiety as something that we should try to overcome, I think that's best understood as psychological anxiety. Again, not something that I'm qualified to talk about. When it comes to existential anxiety, I think the right response is we embrace the anxiety in order not to be wrecked by fear. No matter what we do or don't do, the risk remains. The anxiety is still part of what it looks like to be a being who is not infinite, who is not absolute, who is not permanent, all things considered. So how do we then live? We live by taking up that anxiety as a motivation not to be wrecked by the reality of risk. We are not crushed by those fears. But the only way that we're not crushed by fear is because our anxiety is actually what propels us forward into making the best decision we can with the information we have. So what does it mean to live authentically in light of anxiety? It means to embrace what it means to be beings like us. It means not to try to overcome the human condition, but to live more fully as a human, to live humanly, and to encourage others to do so as well. So at the end of the day, maybe we would do better in relationship to specific fears if we realize that when we are wrecked by those fears, we are not owning up to the anxiety such that risk becomes part of our daily action, our daily decision. It's always there. That doesn't mean go grab a rattlesnake. It doesn't mean send your bike off a drop that's too big for you. It means stop thinking that we are going to eliminate fear and eliminate risk by being maximally secure and maximally safe if we just choose wisely. No matter what we choose, that anxiety that propels us forward into that remembrance of decision, that continues. But that's a good thing because that's what makes life worth living. As my former mentor David Kangas said when he found out he had terminal cancer, in the end there is the unmanageable, but we would be trivial beings without it. It's that the unmanageable that names anxiety in an existential sense. So today, maybe we can move onward despite fear, precisely in light of the anxiety that reminds us that our decisions are weighty and that our responsibility to live on purpose continues. Yes, we are limited, but maybe that's what makes everything really so beautiful. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.